So I've actually had more than one person ask this question, and it's on the Olivet Discourse. Are you guys familiar with the Olivet Discourse? It's Matthew chapters 24 and 25. So what I realized about this question, because I actually had 3 or 4 people ask the question about the Olivet Discourse, but they were coming at it from different angles. So I realized that the best way to do it was just to break down the whole thing, but that's going to be impossible in just 30 minutes. So we're going to probably spend about 3 or 4 weeks on the Olivet Discourse. And if you're not familiar with the Olivet Discourse, it is the second longest recorded sermon, if you will, or teaching of Jesus, with the Sermon on the Mount obviously being number 1. But the Olivet Discourse is by far the second longest. It's in all 3 of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I think there are several reasons as to why it is so misinterpreted, and we're going to talk about that today. So if you have your Bible, or if you grab the one in front of it in the seat in front of you, turn to Matthew chapter 24. Now, because we have to have context, I'm gonna actually start in chapter 23, verse 32. Now, one of the things that you have to understand while you're turning to Matthew chapter 23, verse 32, is that the Olivet Discourse is, without a shadow of a doubt, what I call eschatological. And eschatological, or eschatology, is just a big theological word for study of end times. That's all it means, okay? So it is about the end times. But what's really important about it is that we have to understand it from the perspective of the end times for Israel, not necessarily for the church. And this is why I believe the Olivet Discourse is so confusing to us as church members and confusing to us as Christians. Does that make sense? Because we're looking at it and we're reading it from our Christian perspective, a Western church perspective, and we're looking at it going, wait a minute, what does this say? Because it seems like Revelation will contradict some of the things that Jesus says about the church, and it seems like Daniel, but they don't. They're actually in continuity. What is happening is that we start with the faulty premise that Jesus was speaking to his disciples about the church, and he's not. Remember, the church hadn't even been invented yet, technically, okay? So you have to understand that first and foremost. And you have to also understand something else. Jesus had just pronounced at the beginning of chapter 23 what is called the 8 woes against the religious leaders in the temple. He was saying, woe is you because of this, woe is you. He says it 8 times, and he just hammers them, okay? And these 8 woes were by far the most descriptive, direct, and focused verbal attacks against them of his entire ministry. And remember, this happened after, just for some context, the triumphal entry, where he shows up in the temple to be crowned king, and they reject him flat out. So now his days are numbered, literally, and he knows exactly what's going to happen. So listen to what he says at the end of chapter 23, which will lead us into the Olivet Discourse. Because what he says at the end of chapter 23 confuses his disciples, and it confuses them greatly, to the point where they are shocked by what he says, so they ask him 2 questions, okay? So that's what starts the Olivet Discourse. So chapter 23, verses 32 and 33. Fill up the measures of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? That's hardcore, right? He just comes out and blasts them. By referring to them as serpents, he in essence was equating them with Satan. It's interesting, in the scriptures we'll get a look at the spiritual realm, like in Job chapter 1 and 2, what we talked about last week, and then we'll get a look at the physical realm, the spiritual battles that we fight. But in some instances, we get both of them. And here we see the physical realm and the spiritual realm the battle that Jesus was having, the physical and spiritual battle against the religious leaders. Because Satan did move Judas to betray Jesus a couple days later, and he was moving the religious leaders to destroy Jesus. So after his straightforward and harsh words to the religious leaders, he said something very interesting to them. He said this, "Therefore, behold, I am sending," this is verse 34, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, catch that. Jesus, in essence, in verses 34 through 36, blamed the religious leadership of that day and that generation for the deaths and the martyrs of all righteous people down through human history. He blamed them for all of them. There's a reason for that we'll get to in just a minute. And he used Abel, the same Abel from Genesis chapter 4, who was murdered by his brother. He names him in verse 35, and then he named a guy by the name of Zechariah. Zechariah was one of the last martyrs in Old Testament historical books. He was martyred, and you can read about his murder in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 through 20, or chapter 24, verse 20. So in essence, what Jesus was saying was that the religious leadership was responsible for the murders of every martyr from Abel to the end of the Old Testament history. Why? Well, because their rejection of the Son of God, in essence, made them responsible for the deaths of all those who were his forerunners and who pointed to his coming. These guys knew the Old Testament, many of them by memory. They had read all of these prophets that came and prophesied about the coming of the Messiah. Guys like Isaiah, who was murdered by being sawn in two, put in a hollow log and cut in half by Manasseh. Guys that were murdered for a whole variety of reasons, going all the way back to Abel, and every one of them predicted that the day was coming that Jesus would come. And there he was right there, and they knew their Old Testament, and they rejected him anyway. So Jesus said, guess what? Because you know the Old Testament so well, and you know the stories of all of those martyrs down through Old Testament history, and you still missed the boat, their blood is on your hands. Their blood is on your hands. Jesus also predicted, quite accurately, by the way, that they would kill and persecute many who came after him and proclaimed him as the risen Lord and Savior. And those of you that have been with this church for a while and have been through the whole study of Acts that Roger's been walking us through, we've seen a lot of people killed for their faith. So the religious leaders were killing these people just as Jesus had predicted. But then he said something very important in verse 39. He said this, "For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." He was leaving his people, but he wasn't leaving them permanently. They will eventually see him for who he is and will proclaim him as the Passover lamb whose blood atones for their sin. And he ended this proclamation in verse 39 by quoting a line from Psalm 118, verse 26. And Psalm 118, by the way, is very, very significant because it is the last of six Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118, that is sung throughout the Passover supper. And Psalm 118 was the last of the six that was sung during the Passover. So it would be the last psalm that they would sing before the Jews would end the Passover supper. And he quotes from it, which is very significant. And if you want to see something that's pretty amazing, and you go to the Last Supper, it talks about them, especially in Mark, singing a song, and then Jesus leaves for Gethsemane. They sang that song. And I will encourage you to do something. This is homework if you want it, okay, for your own personal devotion. Be mindful of the fact that the last thing that Jesus did with his disciples before the Last Supper ended was they sang Psalm 118, okay? Read that psalm this week and think about, while you're reading that psalm, what Jesus knew he was about ready to go through. Because he would be arrested a few hours later, beaten, and everything that he went through before hitting the cross. When you read that psalm, you will be blown away, okay? We just don't have time to do it today, otherwise I would. So Jesus says all of this. He hammers the religious leaders. He hammers them for who they are, for their rejection of him as the Savior. And then he prophesies that Jerusalem and the temple are going to be done. They're over with. And this led to the disciples' two questions in chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. And Jesus' answer to those two questions is what we call the Olivet Discourse. So look at verses 1 through 3. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" It is 2 days before Jesus' crucifixion. And what he has just said to the religious leadership of the Jewish people has stunned and confused the disciples. How could he claim Jerusalem and Israel were going to be destroyed if he truly was and is the Messiah? And at that time, if the temple still existed, how could Jesus say something like this? They were confused because they believed he was and is who he claims to be. So how could the Messiah be amongst them, yet Israel was going to be destroyed? You see, because in their mind, the Messiah was supposed to establish his kingdom forever. That's how they viewed it. He was supposed to establish his throne forever among his people in his land forever. But Jesus had just predicted the destruction of all of that. So now they're like, wait, what? They had left the temple. They had escaped the crowds of the temple. Remember, it's almost Passover. It's only 2 days before his crucifixion. So there would have been thousands of people in that area and thousands of them camping on the Mount of Olives. And they went somewhere private on the Mount of Olives. And when they were alone, they finally had an opportunity to ask him two questions. One was, when will this happen? And two was, what will the sign be that initiates your coming in the end? Now, the reason that this is important is because in the Greek, and Roger said in his sermon, Greek is like underwear. In Hebrew, people know you got it, but you don't want to show it, right? Well, here we need to show it, so don't worry, right? It's the Greek, it's figure of speech. But here's the deal. The article is present with regards to the sign. They are asking for the specific sign as to when the age will be over and the second coming that they didn't know it at the time, when the kingdom was going to be initiated. So they said, when and what is the sign? What is the sign that initiates the coming and the end? Now, this is important because oftentimes we view the disciples as kind of these ignorant hayseeds who, they were just a bunch of blue-collar guys and they weren't like the religious leaders. You have to remember, they went to rabbinical school until they were 13 or 14 years old, and they knew their stuff, okay? And they knew their stuff because based on what they asked him, the two questions that they asked him, they were actually referring to the prophetic words of the book of Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and before I read it, keep this in mind. Jesus says Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, okay? And they're saying, wait, how can this be if you're the Messiah and we think you are? And then the light bulb goes on. The book of Zechariah, what the prophet predicted. Zechariah 12, verses 1 through 3 says this: "The burden of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundations of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around, and when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. It will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it." And then if you flip over to Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 through 4, Zechariah writes this: "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women ravaged, and half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, and when he fights on a day of the battle, in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two, will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south." Both passages talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, but both passages also talk about the Messiah fighting for his people. The disciples related what Jesus had just pronounced against Israel in chapters 23, verse 37 to chapter 24, verse 2, and they realized it referred to Zechariah's prophecies. So naturally, they wanted to know when and what to specifically look for that would have tipped them off that the end was near. Their questions also showed that they truly believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And because he is the Messiah, they wanted to know how he and they fit into the end of the age. Now, this is where this gets really important, and this can get confusing for us as Christians. Because if you do a careful study of Judaism and Jewish eschatology, or the Jews' belief about end times, it will show you that the Jews of Jesus' day believed in two separate ages. They believed in the present age, and then they believed in the age to come. This is what they refer to him as. The present age represents the time where they are waiting for the Messiah. They still believe they're in the present age, by the way. Okay? We don't look at it that way. Okay? The present age represents the time where they are waiting for the Messiah, and when he comes at the end of the present age, they believe he will pronounce judgment on Israel's enemies. Once that happens, it ushers in the age to come. The age to come represents the time when all of the Old Testament covenants, all of God's promises are fulfilled, and the Messiah rules over his people. Okay? So you have the present age, which, again, they believe they're living in now. The present age, they're waiting for the Messiah. They'll know that the present age is coming to an end when the Messiah comes and when he judges all of Israel's enemies. And when he does that and he purges Israel of all its enemies, that will usher in the age to come. The age to come represents the time then when the Messiah rules, and all the promises that have yet to be fulfilled in the Old Testament, which we believe are a lot fewer because we believe many of them were fulfilled by the person of Jesus Christ, right? But all the promises that have yet to be fulfilled, that's when they're fulfilled. So you catch that? Really important to know the difference. You've got the present age and the age to come, and this is how the Jews viewed it. Well then, the vast majority of the first century church happened to be Jewish. So because of that, they believed that the life, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven of Jesus were overlapping events within these two ages. So they were throwing a curveball. The Jews that said, holy cow, Jesus is Lord and Messiah. He was resurrected from the dead. The tomb is empty, and he ascended into heaven, and there's all these eyewitnesses that have talked about it. now what? The age to come, he's not, first of all, our enemies haven't been judged, because when Jesus ascended in heaven, they were still ruled by Rome, right? And second of all, the covenantal promises aren't being fulfilled, and the Messiah isn't ruling over us. So we got this weird problem. So they decided that what was happening was the reality was that the life, death, and resurrection and ascension into heaven by Jesus was a connector. And so now they're living in this kind of like limbo, if you will. It is incredibly important. It's incredibly important that we view the Olivet Discourse through the lens of a Jewish mindset. Why? Because that is how the disciples thought. They were all Jews. And by the way, Jesus also was a Jew and is a Jew. And that is what drove their questions. And by the way, that's exactly how Jesus would answer those questions. So this is again where the disconnect usually comes in for us as Christians, because we don't think like Jews, which is fine. We don't have to. I mean, we need to be aware of the scriptures because with the exception of 2 books, they were all written by Jews. So we need to have some sort of a cultural, historical context, but we don't have to think like them. That's okay. We just have to be aware of what is happening so that we will understand better what is going on. So Jesus is answering their questions from the perspective to help them understand the role that Israel and the Jews will play during the tribulation, book of Revelation, and the lack of a role, I believe, the church will play during the tribulation. So the church will, I believe, be raptured before the tribulation. Okay? The events in the Olivet Discourse and Revelation and Daniel talk about Jews. Doesn't say anything about the church. And by the way, in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, that's all that's talked about in the church. And then from Revelation 4 until the new heaven and new earth are ushered in Revelation 21, the church is never mentioned again. Only Jews and Israel are mentioned. Now you might say, well, that's kind of an argument from silence, and you would be 100% accurate. However, I do think it is fairly important, okay? So I believe that the church is raptured before the tribulation. And if I'm wrong, by the way, it's not going to ruin the Christian faith or it's not going to destroy my salvation. It's just a theological difference because there are some who believe that the church will be raptured midway through the 7 years. There are some that believe it'll be raptured at the end of the tribulation. And it's just differences. They're doctrinal differences that really don't have any say in the grand scheme of things, but it's important to discuss. We need to understand what we believe in order to defend it. And again, I'll say this again, this is why I believe the Olivet Discourse is so difficult for us to understand, because we are looking at it with our Western Gentile Christian mindset, and Jesus is answering 2 Jewish questions posed by his disciples who were Jews that want to know what is going to happen to Israel and the temple and Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Okay? So, after they ask the questions of when and what, when will this happen? What will the sign be? Look at verses 4 through 14. And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am in the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famine and earthquakes. But all those things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, because lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. The gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, just so you know, because I will be referring to some of the verbiage that's used in their accounts, the Olivet Discourse is found in Luke chapter 21 and Mark chapter 13. And the reason I think that's important for you to know is because every once in a while I will quote from them as we finish up this morning. Through its history, Jerusalem has been subjected to 4 world empires: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Okay? The disciple John, who would have been present for the Olivet Discourse and heard every word we are examining these next couple of Sundays, wrote his book of Revelation in 95 to 96 AD. And by then, Jerusalem had already been leveled as a city and the temple had been destroyed. That happened in 70 AD by General Titus and the Romans. So John's talk in Revelation is of the future destruction of Jerusalem, which means it was after Jerusalem had already been destroyed. And when he wrote Revelation, it hadn't been rebuilt yet. I mean, people were living there, but it was still a disaster. Okay? Now, I bring that up. You're probably saying, what in the world? I bring that up because Jesus' answer on the question about the end of the age, which because his disciples were Jews, as we pointed out and asked it, meant that they were asking about the end of the present age. Remember the 2 ages. In chapter 24, verses 4 through 26, mirror the seal judgments that occurred during John's tribulation in Revelation chapter 6. In other words, when you read, and I would encourage you to read it this week, when you read Matthew 24, verses 4 through 26, because we won't get to 26 today, we have to shut it down at verse 14. When you read those, 13 verses, they resemble or are really close to what John talks about in Revelation chapter 6. They are also really close to what Daniel talks about in Daniel chapter 9. And in all 3 passages, all 3, Jesus, John, and Daniel, are talking about what is going to happen to Israel and the Jews. It's really important to understand. The other thing to understand is this, because again, we won't get to the actual answers to the questions today, is Jesus only answered their second question specifically. What will the sign be? He does not answer their first question. He answers it in a general way. There will be wars and rumors of wars and famine and earthquakes and all this other stuff. And people will be coming saying, I'm the Messiah. But that's just, he said, the beginning of the birth pains, right? So he doesn't answer the when specifically. He will, and we'll look at this next week, answer the what. So why didn't he answer the when? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, as we talked about last week, God is sovereign, so he doesn't have to answer it if he doesn't want to. And this is speculative, and this is Acts 17:11. But I think he didn't answer the when question because if the disciples didn't know when, if we don't know when, then that should give us a sense of urgency with regards to our evangelism. And it also forces us to live with more faith, right? If I knew the when, what's the point of having faith? I'm just counting down the days, right? He's not going to tell us to when because we have to live by faith. He's not going to tell us to when because we have to proclaim the gospel, right? It could happen this afternoon. It could. And if it does, yeah, that would be awesome. And if it did, great. But holy cow, if we knew if it did, I don't know about you guys, but I'd be going, oh man, the day is here, and there's a lot of people that I need to share Jesus with because they won't be with me on Judgment Day. And that is a scary thing. So I think that is why. Those are the 2 reasons. But again, Acts 17:11. But the what answer forces them to be on the lookout. And it should force us to be on the lookout. Every good theologian throughout history believed they were living in an age that was close to the end. When Augustine was dying on his deathbed in Hippo, the Vandals had besieged the city of Hippo, and he thought the end was near. Martin Luther literally thought the Pope was the Antichrist. Okay? It doesn't matter where you look down through history and you look at certain figures, and people will say the end is near. You read Bonhoeffer's book, and he had thoughts of Hitler being the Antichrist. Every good theologian, male or female, needs to look at the present age and go, is this the sign? Is this it? Because that means, by the way, that we're digging into this word. And so there are two questions while he doesn't answer one, which requires us to have a sense of urgency with evangelizing our faith, but number two is living by that faith. But the number two question of what, that forces us to be on the lookout. And that is a good thing. So, I just lost my place because I got on a rant. That's probably a good thing. You guys don't need it anymore. All right. So, if he is saying that the present age ends when the sign is initiated, and we'll talk about that sign next week, and the age that is to come then would be instituted, but that would only be the beginning of the birth pains. And if we tie this portion of the Olivet Discourse to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, Matthew 24, verses 4 through 8 is the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. Verses 9 through 26 of Matthew chapter 24 is the second 3.5 years of the tribulation, and that's when everything goes south for the nation of Israel. Everything goes south. And here's why. Because what we see with regards to Jesus' answer is a marvelous picture of the sovereign, holy loyalty of our God towards his chosen people. Look at verses 9 through 14 one more time, and then we'll wrap it up. Then they will deliver you. It's in the plural there, and he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to the nation of Israel, to tribulation, and they will kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. God's chosen people will be subjected to a tribulation they have never seen before because of their rejection of him, Jesus. But they will not be replaced, nor will they be forgotten. They will be the light of the gospel during the tribulation because they're going to be the ones that preach it. The gospel of the kingdom, verse 14, shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. You know, Paul Johnson, who is a British historian, wrote a book called The History of the Jews. And he writes, since Jesus' words in the Olivet Discourse, the Jews have been the most persecuted people in human history, which I believe helps make the case that they're still God's chosen people. Because if they weren't, if the church had replaced them, then the enemy would no longer care. Anti-Semitism would be irrelevant, right? What we have seen in the past, however, with the Holocaust and any other thing you can think of with anti-Semitism, will be nothing compared to what we will see at the end of the age. It's no wonder that Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke. So what's our application? Well, the first thing is we have to dig into the Word, and we have to be diligent in our study of it. It's really important. You know, a faith that is going to be lived is a faith that needs to be comprehended and understood. We're not going to understand everything. We can't. We see through the mirror quite dimly. But I encourage you to dig into this book. But not only to dig into this book, but to try to understand the historical context and cultural context around this book. It'll make it come alive. The second thing is this. Be on the lookout. Be on the lookout for the signs. And we're going to talk about all of them next week, or the sign in particular next week. But be on the lookout for the sign. And that means if you're on the lookout, you're being diligent about your faith. And that's the last application. Share your faith because we don't know the when. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this great group. Thank you for your word and what it teaches us about who you are as a loyal and holy God. Lord, you are a keeper of your promises, and we love you for that. In your name I pray. Amen.